strength to the Lord of Lords. Power and strength to the Lord of Lords. Known before the seen and future.
I appreciate very much the opportunity to be with you. I think we were going to lose the lights up here. It might help just a little bit with the screen. There's some things that I think you may be interested in seeing tonight. I think we've got some exciting things to show you. I had the privilege of listening to Brother Andrew Jonas, the lessons that you heard yesterday, and enjoyed very much those lessons and appreciate what he had to say. When I'm following some speakers, I'm not always that happy. I can give you an example of that, and I can do it better if I had a clicker that was working. Here we go. Dr. Ronald Handel, professor of Hebrew Bible at Berkeley. Now, you would think a professor of Hebrew Bible is somebody that's going to back up somebody who believes the Bible, and he starts out saying the biblical story of Noah's flood is an exemplary and an immortal narrative in this respect. I mean, he's backing it up, sounds like, but then he goes on to say, even if it didn't happen, it's a true story. This is the double talk that you get in the universities today, and sometimes it's worse than that. I think that's definitely speaking with a forked tongue. I want to emphasize that this is a real story, that it is true, and that's exactly the position that we see taken by Christ. Matthew 24, the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. Well, that's what Jesus said his coming is going to be like, his judgment. And if you don't believe the days of Noah, what does that say about Jesus and his judgment? Of course, the people in Noah's day laughed, ridiculed, and we're not surprised when we see that kind of thing today. I'm amazed at so many who claim to be Christians who try to separate the Old Testament from the New. And, well, these Old Testament stories, they're myths and they're analogies, and they spiritualize these ideas so that you just don't have to believe them. I don't think that's a tenable position when you see the way the New Testament writers referred continually to the Old Testament. There are 165 passages in the New Testament that refer to Genesis. Now, that doesn't sound like they're just mythologizing this, does it? And never does it refer to it as a myth. There are 100 passages that refer to the first 11 chapters of Genesis. 100 passages. There are 65 passages that refer to the first 3 chapters. Now, that's not talking as if it were a myth. This is just matter of fact, as Jesus did regarding the days of Noah. There are 14 passages that refer to chapters 6 through 8, which are the flood chapters. Christ himself refers to each of the first 7 chapters of the book of Genesis. So how in the world can you say, well, yeah, I accept Christ, but I don't accept those stories of the Old Testament? That's just not going to work, is it? Peter certainly affirmed his faith in the flood when he says they deliberately suppress this fact. Now, this is the New English translation, which, by the way, is a very good translation. The world existing at that time was destroyed when it was deluged with water. This is a fact. And then he compares that to the coming judgment of Christ. And so if you have faith in Jesus, then you have to have faith in what the Old Testament says. It just won't work. We not only have to fight the battle showing that this was real, a lot of people will say, well, yes, yeah, I think it was real, but it was just a local flood. National Geographic, of all publications, had an article affirming, yes, we believe in the flood. And here are two geologists who were atheists who were saying, yeah, there probably was a flood that the Black Sea overflowed and flooded the Mesopotamian Valley. And they thought it was a big flood, and so they said it was around the world. It was a global flood, but if you believe Scripture, that just doesn't work. There are at least 30 universal terms that are used in those flood chapters that we see referenced in the New Testament. All, everywhere. That's just the way it's referred to, and these are not talking about filling a Mesopotamian valley. And besides that, you got birds that you have to put in the ark. They just fly over the hill. Why do you need? They can get out of the valley easy, or animals can run around. You don't really need an ark if you just got a valley to fill up. We do find flood traditions from around the world. Anthropologists have found over 300 separate accounts from all over the world. I can recall buying a boomerang in the outback in Australia and asking the vendor there what this drawing on it was. Well, you're 8 people. This is the story of the ark and the destruction of the world and the animals that were collected. In the middle of the outback, they don't have many local floods there that they can extrapolate into a worldwide flood. That just makes nonsense. Genesis 7, verse 19, the water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that most of the mountains, all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. Verse 23, he blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the land. Now, we note the qualifying factor that he's talking about animals on the land. You don't need fish on the ark, do you? But when people count up all the ones, the species and critters that ought to have been there to try to ridicule the story, they ignore that point. But only Noah was left, together with those that were with him in the ark. All the people in the Mesopotamian Valley. Now, this just doesn't fit. How many people were there on the earth? Well, they'd all fit in the valley. Hadn't been that long from creation. Have you done the math? Do you know how many there were? I think you'll find it mind-boggling. When you people today talk about the population explosion, a lot of the things they're saying are nonsense, but they're telling the truth here, and they really cannot deal. It's worse than they describe it, in that if you have hundreds of thousands of years involved, you've got too many people. Too quick. We do see in Genesis 6, verse 11, the earth was corrupt in the sight of God. The earth just had people in the Mesopotamian Valley, or filled with violence. We do some calculations, not simple calculations when you're trying to talk about the growth of the population, but how many people would there be if you begin with 2 from the time of the creation to the flood, following the population growth patterns that we see today? Well, this is the formula for predicting the population growth rate. E is an exponential function, and R is rate, T is time, and we won't get into the details of the math, but you have to know the rate, and the population growth rate has varied dramatically. Some of the our third world countries will have about 4%, which is pretty high. In America, it's been around 2 for a long time, but it has dropped dramatically fairly recently to less than 1. So let's be as conservative as we can in our calculation. Let's just say it's growing slowly like it is now, 0.81. How many people from the creation to the flood, using the formula that is typically used to calculate population growth rate. You got over 1 billion souls on the earth, all in the Mesopotamian Valley. Actually, 1.24 billion is the number. Notice in Genesis chapter 9, verse 13, I set my bow in the cloud. It will be a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. Never again is the implication. And of course, there never has been a local flood since then, has there? Whatever happened was unique and would never happen again. He's not talking about a local flood. One of the obvious things that geologists know about are seashells on mountaintops around the world. And the way they explain that just gets really comical. But if you look at Mount Everest, right up on top, you find all kinds of seashells. The Geologic Column, which we'll be talking about, Lord willing, later in the week, looks something like this. And right down at the bottom, you've got seashells, I think critters that lived at the bottom of the ocean at the time of the flood, preserved there. But that's what you find on top of Mount Everest. The Cambodian, the Cambrian, the Ordovician fossils that are the first and the second layers at the bottom are what are at the top of Mount Everest. Now, I couldn't have designed that to make fun of them any better than that. It's like God sticking his tongue out at them. I'm going to put some fossils up here. How did they get up there? I think I know. When we go to Mount Ararat, we got seashells up on the mountain. These are pictures of shells that I have collected from well over a mile up on the mountain. These were collected at 7,800 feet by myself, 2013. There are not any seashells growing up there right now. I think I know how they got there. Seashells on mountaintops in the Pyrenees, Rocky Mountains, in Bolivia, around the world, consistently. Now, I think I know how that happened. If you're a geologist, you know about pillar lava, which we're looking at here, the pillar-looking shaped rocks that only form underwater. Even Wikipedia, which is not that authoritative, but even they know that lava contains characteristic pillar shapes that are attributed to extrusion of the lava underwater. Pillar lavas are generally used to confirm subaqueous volcanism. This picture was taken at 8,200 feet. The pillar is not soft, but it's very obviously pillar lava. In fact, you will find when you look that up in the geology textbook, the pictures of the pillar lava won't be this good. You can see the cross section over here and the concentric circles. This is a perfect example. And as you go further up the mountain, you see even more. Here is more of it, a field of pillar lava at 12,200 feet, well over 2 miles up. And it has to form underwater. It doesn't form otherwise. Now, I just think the idea that you can't have a 2-mile high local flood, can you? Can you do that? I don't think that'll work. You don't have to be a physicist to understand that. One of the arguments that certainly refutes the idea of this local flood idea is the global extent of some of the sedimentary layers, some of which are very unique in their characteristics that you can trace around the world. One of the most obvious is the Austin chalk. Now, it was described that way near Austin, Texas, but it is very chalk-like. It has specific, unique characteristics, a particular type of fossil, and then below it, the glauconic sands, above it, glauconics. It's one you can recognize easily But notice the description here from Derek Ager, who was president of the British Geological Association. Some general explanation is surely needed for such a wide distribution of such a unique facies, that is, the type of rock. Extends essentially in the same form all the way from Texas to the USSR. That's a big flood. The similarities are almost laughable, laughable in comparison to their explanation of that. This is a picture of the Austin Chalk in Israel, and I've personally collected samples in Austin, Texas, in England, in Turkey, in Israel, in Jordan, and in Egypt. One unique layer that circles the globe. I think that's good evidence of a universal flood. It was exactly what the Bible says. The flood traditions of anthropologists have found would confirm that. The seashells on the mountaintops, the pool of lava, the global layers all tell us that this was not only real, it was global. And that just won't fit, certainly, the evidence from geology as well as Scripture. But how in the world do you get all those animals on that little bitty boat? You ever heard that? Bill Nye, the science guy, uses this as a theme song. His hat says you need to have a bigger boat because there are just so many animals. This is one of the arguments that's made that argues there's about 1 million species that he says ought to be represented there. As we transferred this, we lost a little bit of the formatting here, but I think you can get the picture. It is interesting that arthropods are better than half of the whole insects. Now, I don't think Noah had to collect 2 of the insects. I think he probably was working hard to keep them off and just couldn't quite do it. Really didn't want those mosquitoes on there, but how do you keep them out? Plus, they're floating log mats where insects could have lived. That's not a problem, and that's most of what he has in his list. But you look at the fishes and the sponges, you don't need those on the ark, do you? If you eliminate all but the mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians, many of which do live in the ocean, then you've got a more accurate picture, and at that point you've got a total of about 17,000 land animals, not those that live in the ocean. 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by ocean, so most of them are in the ocean. And when you then adjust his ridiculous calculations, you say, well, that's not as many, and then that's really an exaggeration because we've got lots of them that do live in the ocean. Plus, we're not talking about species when we're reading Genesis, we're talking about kinds, aren't we? This is not kinds, this is species. And as you look at the way Genesis treats the term kind, you see it's obviously broader than species. Hawks reproduce after their kind, singular, but that includes many species. Fishes after their kind, that's singular, kind, one kind, but that includes many. So we see what's broader and what's narrower, and you understand that hawk includes many. Well, anyway, I think it's more like family than kind. But let's just use the species as a generous example. Multiply times 2. And of course, many animals have become extinct. That's a downhill process, by the way. We're told by some of the environmentalists we're losing a species a month, which does not sound like evolution to me. But let's just be generous and say we've got half as many as we used to have, which is definitely downhill, so we double the number for extinction. Clean animals, there weren't nearly as many, those that were used for sacrificing, 7 each of those. Let's say there were 5,000. Now, that's a great exaggeration. So that if you just stretch every parameter, you come up with a total of 75,000 maximum. I think a more reasonable explanation of kinds is more like 5,000, and some of our creation scientists have indicated maybe half of that would be more reasonable. But generously, 5,000 kinds times 2, and then plus 100% for those that have gone extinct. Maybe 1,000 clean animals is more reasonable. I think a more reasonable estimate is about 21, no more than 25,000. Well, is there room for that on the ark? I don't think that's the challenge, maybe 21,000. If you're thinking about an ark like this, 21 or 25,000 is a lot of animals. But that's not the kind of boat that we read about in Scripture. It looked more like this. And yes, there are dinosaurs going up the gangplank. I think we can prove beyond any shadow of a doubt, as you'll see later in the week, that they were and had to be on the ark. Well, how big was it? You have to know what a cubit is. I think a cubit, for several reasons, for the ark was about 21 inches. It ranged from 18 up to 36 for the Egyptian royal cubit. But there's good reason, and we don't have time tonight to go into all of the reasons, but that certainly is within the range that no one would argue about. If that's the case, then we're looking at 525 feet long. It's almost 2 football fields long, almost 90 feet wide, 52 feet high. If you're familiar with with the Chiefs Stadium, you have to multiply that times 2, almost, and that will give you an idea of how long the ark was. Do you think of the ark that way? That's not like the little Fisher-Price thing you play with in the bathtub. It's about the height of a 5-story building. So we're talking about really a large structure. Maybe some of you have seen the replica in Kentucky. I would have been much happier if they had built an ark instead of a ship. They've got the wrong shape, but the size is well done, and they do a very good job of showing the feasibility of this structure and holding the animals. If it's a 21 cubit measurement that we're following, then we've got well over 2 million cubic feet, which goes beyond our capacity to calculate pretty quickly. That equals about 750 railroad cars. Now, there has never been a train with 750 railroad cars. But that would be the capacity, and it gives us an idea. How many animals could you get on 750 railroad cars? Well, you got to know the average size animal. And we normally think of horses and cows and the bigger animals. There are many more mice and shrews. The average turns out to be about the size of a cat. But you don't ship many cats across the country in railroad cars, and it's kind of hard to figure out how many you could fit. You do ship sheep across the country in railroad cars regularly, and there is a standard. About 240 sheep per double-deck railroad car is the standard, and that's what they do to ship sheep across the country, which would give us 180,000 animals. And how many did we have to have? Well, using a reasonable estimate of the kinds is 21, 25,000, a maximum of 75, exaggerating all the parameters, and we got room for 180. No, I don't think there were that many, and using the more reasonable parameters, you've got lots of extra room. some say, well, dinosaurs would be way too big. Well, from the structure we just described, that's not necessarily the case. Plus, you wouldn't have to have the adult or the grandpas. Now, one unique thing about reptiles is they grow continually all their life. Mammals have their bones ossify. When they mature, they don't go bigger. But reptiles continue to grow. And I think they lived longer before the flood, like the people, in which case Supersaurus was big. We'll look at some pictures of those later. The average that we find today and of course some of the dinosaurs were turkey size, chicken size, and some of them very big. The average, we're told, according to PLOS 2014, it was about 14,000 pounds, about the size of an American bison. And so we've got about 50 kinds using, I think, the proper creationist view of kinds. So 50 pairs of bisons would not take up that much room in the kind of vessel we're talking about. And they wouldn't, the dinosaurs, of course, when we're looking at this average size coming up with the bison, that's because we're looking at adults. They didn't have to be, and I think when you're looking at repopulating the earth, the oldsters are not the ones you choose, the younger ones. And many will say, but wait a minute, why don't we read about dinosaurs in the Bible? They're not there, and so I don't believe in them. Well, the word dinosaur was invented by Sir Robert Owen, who was a strong creationist, established the British Museum of Natural History. He invented the word in 1842. That's the first time that word was used. Now, the King James Version talks about dragons all the way through it. But there was no word dinosaur back then. And I think that's what they're talking about. Notice the description from World Book Encyclopedia. Dragons of legend are strangely like the actual creatures that have lived in the past. They're much like the great reptiles which inhabited the earth long before man is supposed to have appeared on the earth. Every country had them. This is the evolutionist reproduction, the restoration of Dracorex hogwartia, found about 20 years ago. If you're familiar with Harry Potter, Dracorex hogwartia, it's from Harry Potter's dragon. So, assuming that the kind equals species, using the estimate that Bill Nye, the science guy, used, doubling for extinction, doubling the average size, we get a maximum of 75,000 in a boat that had a capacity of 180,000, which says you can accommodate all of them in 42%. A more reasonable estimate of 5,000 kinds of animals would be accommodated in 12% of the ark. And that just says the atheist is the one that's being ridiculous. What do you mean you can't get all those animals on the ark? Well, have you put the pencil to it? No, I haven't done that, but I know the boat's not big enough and too many animals. Well, how many animals were there and how big was the boat? I don't know, but, well, we can know, and when we find out, we see that they're the ones that are being ridiculous. There have been a lot of inventive, just ingenious objections that people that don't want to believe the Bible have come up with that were researched by John Wood Marapi. All of the objections that he could find over the past 100 years are in this book, and he answers them. You know, if you want to know about how to answer those objections, this is a whole lot more than you want to know. I would recommend the book, and I think he has absolutely obliterated the objections, and we've just of course, scratched the surface in our quick run-through. It is a feasible story, and the ridicule, we're the ones that need to do the ridiculing. But another question, different question. Understand, this is not the same. Different question. Could it still be there? Well, you get all kinds of speculations. Some have looked at it seriously. Interestingly, Gilbert Grosvenor, who was the first editor of National Geographic, very different from the one today, made this comment about some who had speculated about the possibility in his day. He said, the discovery of Noah's Ark would be the greatest archaeological find in human history, the greatest event since the resurrection of Christ. It would alter all the currents of scientific thought. And I think he's absolutely right. It would not only answer the skeptics that ridicule the Bible with the story and make the liberal religionists that dominate Christianity today, so-called, look ridiculous, but geology would have to start all over. We've got an average of 1.5 miles of sedimentary rocks that we'll be talking about later in the week. These horizontal layers that you see when you drive through the road cuts and look at it as you drive along the highway. Horizontal layers laid down one after the other, laid down by water with billions and billions of dead things in it. And if you got layers of rock, an average of 1.5 miles covering all the continents with billions of dead things in it, what does that sound like? They explained it over millions of years. If we've got a vessel 3 miles high, almost 2 football fields long, you don't have a local flood 3 miles high. You've got a universal flood, and that would explain it dramatically. And there'd be no way to miss it. You look at the results of floods today, it's devastating, and some people say, well, it just was a gentle flood and it didn't leave any signs. They don't know anything about floods. Anybody with experience knows better. But they're crazy people who, here's one who says, we found the Ark on Mars. Here's one that says 40 feet under Saddam's palace, they found the Ark in Iraq. And of course, that doesn't help us any. Is it possible? Many would say, well, it is not possible to have an Ark 4,500 years old, which is just nuts if you have any experience in archaeology. This was published in Nature just a few years ago, dating Chinese noodles, 4,000 years. You got noodles 4,000 years old. An ark covered with pitch, 4,500 is not a problem. The pharaonic sunboat, which was buried near Cheops, the Great Pyramid, is made out of wood and tied together with ropes. It's supposed to be 4,500 years old, the age back to the Ark. I don't think it's quite that old, but almost. And it's tied together with ropes, and the ropes are in great shape. What's the problem here? That's not a challenge, obviously. Interestingly, appearing in PLOS here just a few years ago, they found maybe Noah's shoes, perfectly preserved 5,500-year-old shoe. The Ark was 4,500 years. In a cave in Armenia, Armenia is about 6 kilometers from the mountain that border. I was amazed to find even the shoelaces were preserved. That's found about 50 miles from Mount Ararat. I thought that was an interesting find. Another factor that's often missed is that pitch is certainly an excellent preservative. And he said, make yourself an ark of gopher wood, cover it inside and out with pitch. Well, what's gopher wood, and how would they do it with pitch? I think much of the petroleum products were the result of the flood, The word translated pitch is probably better translated resin. We have done experiments taking birch bark, boiling it, and it makes a perfect black resin that the Indians had used to make waterproof for their boats. It works beautifully. We have done it. One of the things that I really have never been able to figure out, we're looking here at the Ark. It looks like a lot of the pictures, and we're not talking about the shape, but what's one problem that ought to just jump out at you? What color is pitch? Have you ever seen a black ark? I don't think I've ever seen a black ark. I think it was black. I think it was much bigger than we normally depict it. So we made the men smaller here, and we made it black. And of course, then it almost disappears against the black volcanic rock, but that's another story. And what in the world is gopher wood? We don't know. We have found some manuscripts just across the border in Armenia, which do indicate from that period that it's more a type of construction than a species of wood, like plywood, gopher wood. You don't go looking for a ply tree. But laminated wood that would form beams like this would certainly be feasible and fits perhaps even better the definition of that word. Wikipedia talks about laminated wood, not in the context of gopher wood, but about laminated wood. Pound for pound stronger than steel, has greater strength and stiffness, soaring arches for domed roofs spanning more than 500 feet. Well, yeah, that's about the right length, isn't it? Longer spans, heavier loads compared with steel. Complex shapes, easy to use, completely waterproof. And you need it stronger, just add a few more layers. I think that's probably what we'll find, and we should know definitively very soon. One of the problems is it's in a bad spot politically. It's in western Turkey, or eastern Turkey, I'm sorry, right up against Iran and Armenia. Former Soviet Armenia, Iran, these are not, well, Armenia is not so bad, but Iran is certainly a challenge. It's about 150 kilometers from Syria and Iraq. This is not a nice place in the world today. And that's where Mount Ararat is. This part of Turkey has been at war with the Kurds for the past 40 years, and they've killed about that many thousand, 40,000 people in that war, and so it is definitely a war zone. I'm standing here actually in Iran, barely, which is as far as they'd let me go. I did talk with some of the officials, and they smiled and said, yes, we're glad to have you. Turn around and go back home. But I'm standing right there in that spot taking a picture in the opposite direction, and there's Mount Ararat. It's right there at the border of Iran. And then we go to the north, and here's the capital of Armenia, and there's Mount Ararat. And this is where we'll be flying in about a month or a little less for an expedition up the mountain. Flying into Armenia and then crossing the border. We've had some problems crossing the border, as we'll talk about in a moment. So politically, it's a difficult area. Ancient writings, though, are very encouraging and describe in detail exactly what the Bible indicates. The Sumerian king list, the Gilgamesh epic, the Atrahasis epic, All of these mentioned, now they're not exactly the shape, the size, the details, but the basic idea is the same. Josephus, well-known first century Jewish historian, said this about it: all the writers of barbarian histories make mention of this flood and of this ark. Now, if you're not Jewish, you're barbarian. All the historians, that's fairly general, but he does mention 5 specifically, some of the better known, including Herodotus, the father of modern history, as he's referred to. The land also possesses the remains of the ark, remains which to this day are shown to those who are curious to see them. So evidently in his day it was seen, it was there, and everybody knew about it. This was his claim, and then we check what the other 5 that he refers to. Some, at least 3 of them we can confirm. Others are not extant today. We have not time to go through all of the evidence, but that will give you an idea of some of the ancient references. What we see historically is that in Josephus' day, everybody knew about it, and then those sightings dwindled and disappeared within several hundred years, and we hear nothing more about it until 1840, when there was a huge earthquake that blew out the side of the mountain, shook the ice loose, and evidently exposed that ark again. And since then, we've had at least 25 rather credible sightings, 4 especially. This is the picture that was drawn by one who saw it, Georgi Hagopian. It's not like the old master paintings depict the ark. It's not a ship like what we see up in Kentucky, but it's more like a barge. I've often wondered about the one window. Well, if it runs the whole length and it's more like a baffle on top, it would serve well. Hagopian was among the Armenians who lived at the foot of the mountain that were virtually exterminated. He escaped to America. About 3 million Armenians were killed. The Turks say the Russians did it. The Russians say the Turks did it. And they're both certain. And you don't want to bring that subject up when you're over there. They will start a fight. Anyway, that's a sore spot. He was among the Armenians, and he escaped. However, when he was 12 and then 13, he went up at the end of the summer with his uncle, he said, and saw it and described it, drew the picture that looks like this. Artumov also escaped, came to America, but he was among the 50 who were dispatched by the Tsar to go up the mountain to check out the reported sightings from the Russian aviators. They had seen the vessel sticking out of the glacier, and he, with 49 other soldiers, went up the mountain. They photographed, they measured, they found it, came back. While they were there, the Bolshevik Revolution took place. The Tsar was killed. Most of the clerics were killed. And here they've got pictures of the Ark. Many of them were killed. He escaped for his life, came to Oklahoma City, and made a good reputation for himself as a petroleum engineer in Oklahoma City. He drew this sketch. Actually, that's not true. This is a sketch of a picture that he took. The picture was sketched by his nephew, who saw the picture, promised to provide it to us, but then disappeared. I think I know why. I think he may have been killed. I know George Green was killed. there's a group of people that live on the mountain that, at least in the past, of course, we're talking about very devoutly religious people that follow Muhammad, but they believe the ark and Adam and Eve up to Abraham, just as we do, maybe better than we do. But they have been charged with the responsibility of keeping this pure from the eyes of the infidel, and if they keep it pure, then Muhammad will return here. This is where he's supposed. So they kill people that get close, and George Green was a petroleum geologist flying over the area in 1952 in a helicopter, tracing oil-bearing layers, and took the picture, not as a religious person researching the ark, but just taking pictures. And when he got back home, he saw, as he showed the pictures to some of his friends, Mount Ararat, what is this sticking out of the glacier? And at least 12 of his friends saw those photographs. He then went down to South America, where he was tossed out of the 6th-story window of his hotel room, landing into the swimming pool, and was killed. The only thing missing from his hotel room were the pictures. So it seems that some of those who were charged with keeping this free from the eyes of the infidel had found out about it and killed him. Perhaps our best evidence comes from Ed Davis, who was stationed at the foot of the mountain in 1943, World War II. He was an engineer. He saved the life of one of the Kurdish village chieftain's sons, and as a reward, they carried him up at the end of the summer to show him the ark. He describes it in detail in his diary, and I have interviewed him personally. He did pass away 2002. Don Shockey is pictured here on the right, who's climbed the mountain 7 times and confirmed a number of the things he was saying, showing him a picture, and then he would recognize that and tell him what was not in the picture but off to the right, verifying he was there and that he was telling the truth. He was carried up by a boss who was one of the chieftains, and we found the grandson, not the one whose life he'd saved, but a grandson, and he has worked with us confirming the Ed Davis story. He lived in the house that he was taken to, where they did have artifacts from the ark. Ed Davis drew a picture of what he had seen. Alfred Lee is the commercial artist who worked with him drawing the sketch. This is the result of what they saw. More recently, a more impressive, perhaps, painting based on this technical drawing showed it like this. When he saw it, it had broken in 2, and there were 2 pieces, but he could see into it. A storm came up. He wasn't able to get to it, but he was within about 50 yards, and with his Army field glasses could see into it. And this is his eyewitness account. We've made 7 trips up the mountain, and I think we have located the spot where the ark landed. This Ed Davis Canyon, as it's referred to, is now covered with ice, but we were able to drill down and to hit the wood. We've had some interesting experiences. This is Sahin, one of my heroes. We converted him to Christ and his brother a number of years ago, and he's been helping us. Unfortunately, he was killed about 2 years ago as a result of his association with us. Dick Bright is the one who made the initial contact. Dick has climbed the mountain 36 times, is the grandfather of the projects. Here we see Dick together with two brothers. We have baptized both. Of course, Sahim is now deceased. His brother is the one who's helping us now. And we're involved in a project where we'll be leaving just in a few weeks. Dr. Randall Price is not going on this one. He's been with us on several others. He will come once we get the confirmation. He is Professor of Judaic Studies at Liberty University, the PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Texas. Dr. John Bryant has worked with us and been up on several. He actually helped us locate through the ice. He has his PhD from A&M as a geophysicist. He's licensed as an engineer, as a geophysicist, a geologist, and a geophysicist, or cartographer, I'm sorry. Very highly qualified, to say the least. We've had two alpinists pictured here. Been to the top of Everest to the North Pole. They're in charge together with Sahim and John Bright to keep us alive. This is the mountain. It's 3.5 miles up to this spot. It's hard to conceptualize that in a picture. Traveling up, again, we're reminded this is a war zone. This is a PKK battleground. PKK is the rebel Kurds. They don't want you building roads, and they'll stop you. This was our base camp at 14,000 feet. See how comfortable? All of those rocks came from above and continue to tumble down. And looking down from that spot, you can't see down. It's under the clouds. And then up from the base camp, this is the path. And those rocks tumble and roll. One did under my feet, and I bashed the head in and got about 12 stitches. Had to go down to the Turkish hospital that had more flies than people, and got a very professional head bandage and back up the mountain. This is the route back up to the base camp at 14,000. From there, it ain't easy. There's no air up there, or it seems that way. Once you get up on the glacier, then you have different challenges. Crevasses are everywhere, and they are deadly. It looks safe from the top, but at the bottom, you're going to die. That's just, it's over if you fall through. We had several close calls. You see the crevasse up ahead, you know to avoid that, but the one in the foreground was invisible. Our lead alpinist, and we were roped together, fortunately, went through that hole. And we caught him and pulled him back, but that's where he went down. He did have the presence of mind while he was down there to take some pictures. It's not a fun trip. This is Tom Russell, who is a gospel preacher that I worked with in Dallas. He was a Marine, the kind of fellow that hunts bears with a switch. And he and I were stranded and just almost didn't make it on this particular spot, about 600 feet below the summit. We were stranded in a whiteout for about 24 hours. And if you can't see where you're stepping, you better not be stepping. Winds about 80 miles per hour, about 20 below. And the people who were with us, carrying the duffel bags, saw the storm coming and took off. And we were left without tents or sleeping bags or parkas in 80-mile-an-hour winds at 20 below at about 17,000 feet. We should not have survived. But they did drop some of the duffel bags, and at about 11 o'clock that night, there was a break, and we saw what we thought were rocks. We thought, well, we can get behind that and get some protection from the wind. And one of the duffel bags had a lot of the chemical hand warmers that we stuffed in our shirts and pants and survived that night, barely. So this, again, this is not a fun trip. But I think we had some obvious providence involved. Let me get past this. On up to the summit, this is the way over to the other side, to the Ed Davis Canyon. Not really the purpose of the trip, but it is kind of neat to be able to get there at over 17,000 feet. Getting to the Ed Davis Canyon, where we were able to do the excavating, first night we had 80-mile-per-hour winds, which is not a good place to be in a tent, in a house for that matter. This was Dr. Price's tent the next morning. We had to dig him out. Actually, that's really helpful. That protects from the wind. The next night it got bad. The wind gauge broke at 100 miles per hour. Most of the tents came apart, as you can imagine. I can recommend the North Face Expedition tent, which was wind tested at 100 miles an hour, and it withstood that. Dick Bright's tent that we're looking at here did not. You don't buy your tents at Walmart when you go up the mountain. Here we see Dr. Bryant, who's doing his analysis of the data that we collected by pulling sleds with side-scanning radar. All of that, of course, had to be carried up the mountain together with this apparatus under the dig tent that provided the means for us to cut the blocks in 1-foot squares and then pull them up. And here we see the blocks that were cut as we did the excavation based on satellite telemetry that supposedly told us exactly where it was. Spoofing sounds like a fun term, but it's a technical term that is involved in warfare where you skew the GPS signals of the enemy, and that was going on. We were 20 meters off of where the satellite was seeing it. It's like a mirage. What you're seeing is real, it's just not where you're seeing it. And we were able to do measurements as we recorded some of the spots, and it changed overnight as much as 75 yards sometimes. But we drilled this, or dug this hole. That's a monumental task. And give you an idea of how that works, let me just back that up just a little bit. I went past that. You fill up the canvas buckets and then haul the ice up. Now you want to volunteer for? Some people say they want to come with us on the trip. Well, that says I didn't do a very good job of telling you what was going on. We got to the bottom and it wasn't there. We were getting real-time feedback from a classified source near Albuquerque. He says, "You're right on top of it." And I'm saying, "No, we're not." "Yes, you are." "No, we're not." We did get additional feedback from a Turkey satellite, which was not geosynchronous, that is directly overhead all the time, but came across each day and from different angles did a better job of locating and found that we were 20 meters off. We did then take augers and drill at the spot indicated by the Turkish satellite, and that produced debris at 34 feet down, which is where the satellite said it was. What are we looking at? Well, I went down with the debris, taking it to the microscope in the hospital at the bottom, and would you like to see what I saw? This is an ice cube. It's perfectly clean, pure ice in a bowl. This is what I saw. So I radioed back, said we need more samples. They did. And I said, be sure and wrap it in foil so it's not contaminated. They just stuffed the snow and debris in a fruit jar. And when it came down, of course, it had melted, floating in the muddy water, which was contaminated. But there's the wood with the pitch. That's wood that came up exactly where the satellite said the ark was. You understand what you're looking at? We want to come back with a bigger piece.